Hope you are doing well. There's something about camping that a lot of people enjoy. Maybe it's quiet, or maybe it's getting away from people for a while. But every once in a while, someone ends up somewhere they probably shouldn't have gone. And that's exactly what happened to a man named David. David ran a small camping YouTube channel. For almost 3 years, he'd been traveling to remote locations, spending a night or two outdoors, and filming the experience for his audience. Some videos did well, some didn't, but he enjoyed doing it enough to keep going. One Friday afternoon, after finishing work, David started packing for another trip. At the time, he had no reason to believe this weekend would be any different from the dozens he'd already done before. But a few weeks earlier, he came across the name of a place called Blackwood Trail. So the trail wasn't particularly famous. In fact, there was very little information about it online. There were old hiking forum discussions, a couple of mentions on camping websites, and not much else. What caught David's attention was the lack of recent videos. Nobody seemed interested in the place anymore, and which made him curious. After doing some research, he decided Blackwood would be the next location for his channel. By the time David reached the small town closest to the trail, the sun was already beginning to drop behind the trees. He stopped at a gas station to buy a few supplies before heading into the forest: water, canned food, snack, and few extra batteries for his camera. While paying, the cashier asked where he was headed. When David mentioned Blackwood Trail, the man paused for a moment before saying not many people go out there anymore. David assumed that was exactly why it would make a good video. After grabbing supplies, David walked back to his van and tossed the bags onto the passenger seat. Before heading to the trail, he pulled out his phone and called his wife Maya. The two had been married for almost 10 years and had a 7-year-old son together named Jacob. Whenever David went on these camping trips, he usually called home before disappearing into areas where cell service was unreliable. Maya picked up after a couple of rings. Hey, just stop for supplies. I'm heading to the trail now. Maya asked, how far are you? David said, maybe 20 minutes. There was a brief pause. Then Maya laughed. Jacob wants to know if you're finally gonna bring back pictures of something other than trees. David smiled and hung up the phone. After ending the call, David set the phone aside and started the van. A few minutes later, he left the main road and followed a dirt track deeper into the woods. Eventually, the trees opened into a small clearing, and at the entrance stood an old wooden sign, Blackwood Trail. Below it was another sign that read no camping beyond marker 12. David looked at it, smiled, and continued unloading his gear. Near the entrance was a trail register where visitors could sign in before entering. David wrote down his name, noted that he planned to stay overnight, and started hiking. The first part of the trail looked completely normal. Tall trees surrounded the path, small stream crossed through sections of the forest, and old trail markers appeared every few hundred feet. After nearly an hour of hiking, he finally reached marker 12. About 10 minutes later, he found a small clearing beside a stream. The ground was flat, there was enough space for a tent, and the stream provided easy access to water. It seemed like the perfect place to camp. The rest of the evening passed normally. David set up his tent, gathered firewood, filtered water from the stream, and recorded a few clips for the video. Later, he heated up some canned food and sat beside the fire while talking casually to the camera. Eventually, the fire burned low, and David climbed back to his tent. Sometime after midnight, David woke up unexpectedly. At first, he wasn't sure what had disturbed him. The inside of the tent was dark. He lay there for a few seconds, listening, trying to figure out why he had suddenly woken up. Then he heard a footstep. The sound came from somewhere outside the tent. David stayed completely still. A few moments later, he heard another one. The footsteps were slow and heavy, but they weren't moving away from the campsite. As he continued listening, he realized something that immediately made him uncomfortable. Whatever was outside wasn't simply passing through the area, it was moving around the campsite. More specifically, it seemed to be circling the tent. David sat up and listened as the footsteps continued. Every few seconds, another one came from a different direction. At first, he tried to convince himself it was an animal, but the longer it continued, the less believable that explanation became. He had spent enough nights outdoors to know that wild animals usually move through an area and kept going. This felt different. Eventually, unable to stay silent any longer, David called out into the darkness. The footsteps stopped immediately. For several long seconds, the forest became completely silent. Then another footstep broke the silence. This one sounded noticeably closer. David grabbed the flashlight beside his sleeping bag and tried warning whoever was outside that he was armed. It was nothing more than a bluff. He didn't actually have a gun. For the next several minutes, David remained silent inside the tent, listening for the slightest sound. The footsteps never returned. At some point, just before sunrise, exhaustion finally caught up with him, and despite everything that had happened, he eventually drifted back to sleep. When David woke up again, sunlight was already filtering through the tent walls. The first thing he thought about was the footsteps. He quickly stepped outside and looked around the campsite, expecting to find something that would explain what had happened during the night. Instead, everything looked completely normal. There were no obvious footprints, no broken branches, and no sign that another person had been there. The more David looked around, the more he started convincing himself that he had overreacted. Eventually, he put the whole thing aside and settled into a normal morning routine. Once he finished packing a few essentials into his backpack, including water, canned food, and his camera equipment, he decided to spend the rest of the day exploring more of the forest. While moving through an heavily wooded area, he noticed an old cabin partially hidden behind the trees. The structure looked abandoned. The wooden walls were weathered, several windows were broken, and parts of the porch had begun collapsing with age. Finding something like that in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly common, and David immediately thought it would make a good addition to the video. Normally, he wasn't interested in exploring abandoned buildings, but this one caught his attention. As he stepped inside, it became obvious that nobody had been living there for a very long time. Dust covered almost everything: floor, shelves, furniture. The entire cabin looked untouched. Then David noticed something strange. Near the far side of the room sat a large wooden chair. Unlike everything else in the cabin, it wasn't covered in dust. The chair itself was unusual. It wasn't decorative or expensive looking. It was simply much larger than a normal chair. The backrest was unusually high, and the seat was wide enough to make the rest of the furniture look small by comparison. David pointed his camera toward it and laughed. Looks like I found a king's throne. As he walked closer, he noticed again how clean it was compared to everything else in the room. With that, he sat down. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then David heard a faint sound somewhere outside the cabin. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. He stopped talking and listened. A few seconds later, he heard it again. Someone was humming. The sound was distant at first, almost blending into the surrounding forest. But there was no mistaking it. It sounded like a person. David stood up and listened more carefully. With each passing movement, it seemed to be getting closer. At first, it sounded as though it was coming from behind the cabin. The strange part was that David never saw anyone. The humming continued getting closer, but whoever was making it remained hidden from the view. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood, David felt genuinely uneasy. Then the humming shifted again. David's stomach tightened. Someone was approaching. His eyes scanned the room looking for somewhere to hide, and that's when he noticed a loose section of the wooden floor. Without thinking too much about it, he pulled the panel aside and found a narrow crawl space underneath. He quickly lowered himself below the floor and pulled the panel back into the place. Then the humming stopped. Several seconds later, he heard footsteps. They moved slowly across the cabin floor above him. A moment later, he heard a long wooden creak. It sounded like someone sitting down in the chair. At that point, David no longer cared about filming. He just wanted to leave. But something kept him from moving. Part of it was fear. Another part was the uncomfortable feeling that whoever had entered the cabin already knew he was hiding beneath the floor. The silence that followed only made that feeling worse. David remained hidden for a long time, listening for any sign that the person above had left. Eventually, he heard movement again. The chair creaked. The footsteps crossed the room. A few minutes later, he heard the cabin door open and close. Then the footsteps continued outside. David listened until he could no longer hear them. Even then, he stayed beneath the floor for several more minutes before finally gathering the courage to climb back out. When David finally gathered enough courage to climb out from beneath the cabin floor, the first thing he did was look around the cabin. The cabin was empty, and apart from the dust floating through the air, nothing looked out of place. Whatever had entered the cabin was long gone. David picked up his camera and forced out a nervous laugh. At that point, he wasn't interested in exploring anymore. He wanted to get back to camp, eat something, get some sleep, and leave Blackwood the next morning. As he walked through the forest, he continued recording footage like he always did. Every now and then pointed the camera toward himself and talked. At one point he even said, "Whoever was humming back there can keep that cabin." He laughed after saying it, but the laugh sounded forced. The encounter had clearly unsettled him. The further he walked, the more he found himself thinking about it. After about 40 minutes of walking, David began noticing something strange. The trip back felt much longer than he remembered. The cab hadn't seen that far away earlier in the day, yet he still hadn't reached his campsite. At first, he assumed that he had simply taken the wrong route. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation, so he adjusted his direction and kept moving. An hour passed, then a little more. Still, no campsite. By now, most of the water in his bottle was gone, and the afternoon heat was beginning to wear him down. David was starting to get frustrated. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a chocolate bar, and continued walking while eating it. Once he finished, he crumbled the wrapper and casually tossed it beside a tree before moving on. About 20 minutes later, something made him stop. There was a tree standing directly ahead of him. At the base of that tree sat a chocolate wrapper, his chocolate wrapper. David stared at it for several seconds before walking closer. Then he looked around. Nothing else seemed familiar. There was no reason for him to be back there. Even if he had wandered off course, he shouldn't have ended up at the exact same spot without realizing it. For the first time that day, he began wondering if he was actually lost. The constant walking was beginning to wear him down, so he sat beneath a nearby tree and rested for a few minutes. As he sat there trying to clear his head, he noticed something odd. The forest sounded different. At first, he couldn't figure out why. He could hear insects in the distance. The wind moved through the branches overhead. Everything sounded completely normal, except for one direction. Off to his right, a section of the forest was completely silent. Not quieter, silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. David had no idea how long he'd been walking. The forest looked the same in every direction. Eventually, he stopped beside a fallen tree to catch his breath. He placed his camera on a nearby rock, hoping to capture a few moments of what he had been experiencing. If someone ever found the footage, it might help explain how he had ended up so deep inside the forest. After a short while, David picked the camera back up and continued walking. He had barely gone another 20 or 30 minutes when the ground suddenly gave way beneath him. The camera slipped from his hand, struck the edge of the pit, and bounced several feet away before disappearing into thick bushes. The fall knocked the air out of his lungs. For several moments, he remained at the bottom of the pit, trying to catch his breath. Eventually, using exposed roots and loose rocks, he managed to climb back out. His flashlight was still hanging from his shoulder. His backpack had landed nearby, but the camera was gone. David searched the area for several minutes. He pushed aside leaves, looked beneath fallen branches, even circled the pit more than once. It was nowhere to find. With daylight fading and no sign of it anywhere, he finally gave up. Without realizing, he'd just left behind the only evidence of everything that followed. Then he heard something. Somewhere in the darkness, David immediately stopped moving. This time, he couldn't convince himself it was his imagination. Someone else was out there. David quickly moved toward a large tree and stood with his back against the trunk. At least that way nothing could approach him from behind. Then he heard a faint humming, the exact same humming he had heard near the cabin. A cold chill ran through his body. David slowly turned his head, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be drift through the forest. One moment it sounded distant. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. David remained beneath that tree for a long time. He was exhausted, and he still had no idea where he was. Eventually, he sat down at the base of the tree and told himself he would only rest for a few minutes. Somewhere during those few minutes, he fell asleep. The next thing David remembered was opening his eyes. At first, he didn't move. His head was lowered and his vision was still blurred from sleep. Then, he noticed something standing directly in front of him. Above them hung the bottom of a long white gown. David's entire body went rigid. Slowly, almost afraid to move, he began lifting his head. His eyes followed the figure upward. And then David saw its face. A scream echoed through the forest. For several seconds, the sound carried through the trees before fading into the darkness. And after that, the forest became quiet once again. If you enjoyed this story, I'd really appreciate if you left a like and subscribe to the channel. I'm already working on the next part of Blackwood, and if it everything goes as planned, it should be out in the couple of weeks. So if you don't want to miss it, make sure you subscribe. And as always, thanks for listening.